TL, DR, don't and you won't have to deal. This is a long story, so settle back and relax. I love this sub, and I have taken to asking friends about great revenge stories. This one comes from my boss, who lives in the small town where it occurred. To set the stage, many decades ago, Barney and Betty immigrated from Europe and bought a farm. A few years later, they had kids and sponsored Wilma from the old country as a nanny. She met Fred, a local boy, fell in love and got married. Wilma stayed on as the nanny and Fred worked as a farmhand. Their kids and Barney and Betty's kids grew up together, and it was pretty much a big blended family. Years go by, and Barney and Betty decide to sell the farm fields to Farmer Frank, but kept the land the house was on. They made enough off the sale to build a nice new house and rezoned the property lines. They broke the lot up into 2 parcels, one for the new house and one for the existing house, which they gifted to Fred and Wilma as a recognition of their years of dedicated and loving service. Both houses shared a well and a septic field. More time went by. Barney and Betty passed away, and their house was inherited by their son, Bam Bam. Fred also passed away, and Wilma stayed in the house. She was an angel. Everyone in the town knew and loved her. She was like the town's grandmother. She was active in the church and liked nothing more than crocheting booties for anyone in town that had a baby. Sadly, Wilma passed away too, and her house was inherited by her daughter, Pebbles. She was well established in a nearby metropolitan city and made the decision to sell the house. And so it begins. To give you a better idea of the setup, here is a rough diagram. The parcel for sale is the yellow bit, which backs onto protected parkland and is bordered by Bam Bam's land and Farmer Frank's fields. It was purchased by a builder from the city, which we'll call Dick. The name suits him. He wanted it as a country getaway, as he already had a place in the city. He got approval to improve the place, and his plans were to convert the barn into a multi-car garage with a man cave and an apartment in what was the loft. He started by tearing down the house, with plans to replace it with a bigger, more modern house. The house was torn down, and the new build was started. The lower part of the yellow represents a very narrow driveway. Between that driveway and Farmer Frank's field was a drainage culvert. So the contractors started parking their vehicles on Bam Bam's lot. Bam Bam asked the contractors not to do it, but they didn't stop, so he approached Dick, and the conversation didn't go well. Dick was an entitled big shot, dealing with what he thought was a country bumpkin. To give you an idea, Dick once went to the local diner and asked for the wine list. He was aggressive and disrespectful, and this pretty much set the tone for all future interactions. Bam Bam had enough. These contractor trucks were tearing up his ground, so one weekend he built a fence along the border between his house and Dick's. It wasn't a complicated fence. He just got a buddy with a post hole digger on his bobcat, sunk posts, and strung planks between them. This caused no end of trouble with the build. There was no room to park in the yellow for the contractors without getting in each other's way, and they couldn't park in the driveway, which was only wide enough for one vehicle at a time. Contractors were pissed off. They had a long walk from the road to the build site and had to carry tools and equipment back and forth, either that or take turns dropping materials. Waiting hours for the carpenters to finish unloading the lumber so that the plumbers could unload the pipes. Dick was furious and came stomping over to Bam Bam, demanding that he dismantle the fence. Bam Bam told him to go to hell. Then a day later, Bam Bam saw that someone had removed some of the fence, and the contractor trucks were back on his land. Okay, thought Bam Bam, let's play. The following weekend, Bam Bam irrigated the area where the contractors were parking. Irrigated it long and continuously. He probably had to get a water delivery to make it happen, as the well had a limited capacity. On Monday, the first contractor to arrive turned off Dick's driveway to go through the fence and immediately sank up to his axles in mud. Did I mention that Bam Bam owned the local service station and knew every tow truck company within 100 miles? As it turned out, everyone they called was too busy to pull the truck out, and they had to call a tow truck from the city, almost 2 hours away. You can see how the relationship between Bam Bam and Dick became somewhat less than neighbourly. Time went by, and Dick's house was completed. It was a low-maintenance setup with interlocking brick over the compound, tall hedges separating Dick from Bam Bam. They kept out of each other's way, but they certainly weren't pals. Dick's kids would come up on the weekend and have a party now and then, but Bam Bam put up with it. One issue that arose was when Dick decided to fill the small swimming pool that he had installed. This drew the well dry and caused some sand to be pulled into the water treatment equipment. When Bam Bam approached Dick about the cost of the repair via email, Dick basically replied that it was Bam Bam's problem. The same when the septic holding tank needed to be pumped. Bam Bam offered to split the cost of the pumping, and Dick refused to part with a dime. Years passed, and Dick decided to list the house for sale. That's when Bam Bam made his move. He cut the water and capped the septic line leading from Dick's house. Then he informed the real estate agent of what he had done. Well, that induced a thunderstorm for sure. There's no way Dick could sell a house that had no water, or any way to dispose of waste. He couldn't build a septic field on his property, it was too small. He approached Farmer Frank to buy some of his land, but was rebuffed. His only option would have been to install a septic holding tank, but the only place to put it would have been right in the middle of his compound, and septic tanks can be aromatic. It would also have meant removing the in-ground pool. Dick tried to argue in court that he was entitled to access to the well water and the septic field, but Bam Bam won, arguing that the Wilma and Fred were given water and septic as a courtesy, and that there was no contractual obligation to provide Dick either well water or septic access. There was nothing in the deed to Wilma and Fred that could be grandfathered in, and Dick's emails refusing to pay for maintenance to either system was the nail in the coffin. The property sat vacant and unusable for months. The price dropped through the floor, and the few people that expressed an interest in the property approached Bam Bam with varying offers of cash to restore service. Bam Bam declined. No offers were made to Dick for the house. Finally, Dick did receive an offer from a numbered corporation, an offer that was about a quarter of the asking price. As is, with a statement that the buyer was aware that there was no water or septic service to the property. Without much choice, Dick accepted the offer. And that's how Bam Bam bought himself a beautiful modern country home, at a steal of a price. He reattached the water and septic in an afternoon and moved his furniture down the driveway. He rented his old house out for extra money and had the numbered company negotiate with himself for an arrangement for perpetual use of the well and septic, thereby jacking the value of the house by a factor of 4. Later, if he decides to sell it, he'll be making a massive profit. Bam Bam now enjoys a country paradise and is the social king of the hill in his town. All because Dick decided to be a dick. The revenge was perfect and executed brilliantly. OP patiently set up each move, letting Dick's own arrogance fuel his downfall. By legally cutting off water and septic access, OP created an impossible living situation, forcing Dick to sell at a huge loss. I would say the revenge was beyond perfect. The next story is from Kibufox. Don't fire the guy who holds the patents. This is not my story. I was present for it, sure, but I did not see all of it personally. Rather, this is my father's story. So, some context. My father had a degree in mechanical engineering, either a master's or doctorate. It had taken him years to get, and he was very proud of that. Thanks to his training, he had found his way working for many well-known companies, working primarily with the procedures used to make various things. Over time, he'd privately began working on an idea that would revolutionize how school and gym lockers worked. See, my father realized that there was a problem with those type of metal lockers. Namely, it was very easy for a person to break into them. What's more, as the lockers were designed, there were multiple exposed moving parts, which meant that if a student put too many books in one, or really anything got against the door, the locker could be jammed shut, making it near on impossible to open. So, for several years, Dad toyed with a number of ideas before hitting on a new design which would solve all those problems. The inner workings of the locker's locking mechanism would be contained within the door in such a way that 1. It was impossible for someone to shim or break into, 2. The entire mechanism would be enclosed, and 3. It was relatively maintenance-free. Now, at this point, my father was the vice president of manufacturing, and apparently there wasn't a clause in his contract that said that if he designed anything while working for the company, then he had to turn that over to them for profit. Dad still approached the company, offering them the design, but they weren't interested. Dad sat on the design for a while before eventually just taking out several patents on them, and then forgetting about them. About 6 months after his first attempt at getting the company interested, the parent company's owner, chairman of the board, passed away, and the board opted to sell off some of the holdings. The company my dad worked for was part of that. The new owners were young guys who seemed to think they knew everything, as young business owners always seem to think, and they set about changing 99% of the way things were being done. At some point, they stumbled across the plans my father had designed. Now that's where things turned curious. They really wanted to start producing this new design, but as they didn't have all the plans and processes laid out for them, they had to turn to my father for answers. Rather than asking him how to do it, or licensing the patents, as any reputable company would have done, they ordered him to turn over all his work, or else they would fire him. Dad stood his ground and refused. The new owners and my father went back and forth, arguing over details for several weeks, before finally the new owners fired my father for insubordination. So, on to the revenge. There may be more to this, but I'm not entirely sure if it is just pro-revenge. It could border on nuclear, based on what happened some years later, though I'm not certain that what later happened had anything to do with my father's actions. So, after cleaning out his office and packing things in the trunk of his car, my father headed home and made a few phone calls. He must have gone through 8 or 9 different calls before he got in touch with someone who was interested in what he had to say. See, my dad was under no illusions that the company that had fired him wasn't going to just make those patented lockers on their own. He also knew that though the company itself was relatively small, the owners had money, and there was no way he could fight them. However, a larger company could. So he contacted the major competitors and made them an offer. He eventually set up a meeting with some people, wheeled out the prototype he'd made, explained how everything worked, and noted that with this system, the company could revolutionize the way lockers were both designed and improve both safety and security. What's more, as he was the only patent holder, for the next 7 years or so, that company could be the only company to produce them. The competitor jumped at the chance and bought all patents both for the design and the process. They even paid my dad a substantial consultancy fee to go out to their manufacturing site and teach their crews how to make the needed tool and die sets to produce them. Less than 6 months after the first company had fired him, their number one competitor was completely destroying them in the market with this new design. And there wasn't a damn thing the first company could do about it. They did try suing my father, claiming he had stolen their intellectual property. But that case quickly evaporated when they had to admit under oath that they'd never actually signed a contract with him. And there was no requirement that he turn over anything he created to the company. In the 7 years from when the second company bought the locker design and process patents, they pretty handily moved into markets that previously they'd been unable to. The first company soldiered on, but by the time the patent had finally expired, they were a shadow of their former selves. The new owners had sold the company at a loss, with the competitor buying it, only to shut that production facility down due to redundancy. Put maybe 200 people out of work, though given how they'd lost so much business, I wager that it was far less than that. So yeah, the new guys don't want to play ball, threaten the guy that holds the patents on something they want to do, and then fire him, only to have him take everything to their competitor and effectively put them out of business. Edit. To answer some of the questions that have arose. 1. You don't know what his degree level was? My father and I had a difficult relationship. There are very few good memories I have of him, and it wasn't until shortly before his death in 2007 from a stroke that I really started to connect with him. I resented him for most all of my life because he was more career-minded than anything. I figure we moved some 10 times in 20 years, and it greatly affected me. For a rather long period of time, I am ashamed to say, I hated my father and wanted nothing to do with him. 2. You must have ended up wealthy. Not really. Any money that Dad earned off his little endeavour was lost after an incident that left him disabled. Medical bills being what they are, by the end of it we were pretty much broke. 3. Patents last 20 years. Design patents don't. They last 14, but the courts have historically sided with companies infringing on design patents after 7 years, so long as the infringing company develops their own method to produce whatever design is being used and modifies or changes it. 4. What company was this? You know I can't tell you that. 5. Any variation of, how did the new owners not know? That answer is pure speculation on my part. However, I got the impression that the owners were in their mid to late 20s and trying to act like investors. The company was on offer relatively cheap, from what I know, but had a rather long history in the manufacturing field. The revenge was brutal and, of course, destroying. Ego of the company owner cost him millions for years, and finally he had to sell his company at loss. It is one of the best reminder that never trick with employees. They can become very dangerous. Next story is from Bama Fan 4 Jesus. My grandmother put greedy preachers in their places. Twice, even after she died. TLDR. My grandmother generously served her Bible-believing Christian church for almost 50 years without asking anything in return. But when she became elderly, disabled, and homebound, her church acted like she did not exist. Until she was in hospice care and literally on her deathbed, when that church showed a sudden interest in telling Grandma to remember your church in your will. She waited until exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right audience, to expose these greedy assholes for what they were twice. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. This church, which I'll call Big White Church, was a member of a large evangelical denomination. Big White Church was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the deep south of the USA. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning, helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners, accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours, taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights, and was very active in supporting home missions, as well as helping with other youth programs. She always tithed and often gave extra for missions and special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. I've seen this firsthand many times. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to Big White Church functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of Big White Church youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that on a Big White Church youth retreat at a rural church camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of evangelistic materials that one of the assistant pastors, whom I'll call Ass Pastor, had forgotten and asked her to get, in time for our morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, I'll call him Pompous Pastor, never found out that Ass Pastor had screwed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. Ass Pastor never even thanked Grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said that she didn't mind at all. She told me her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73, when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home, etc., without success. Every one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, pompous pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service, which she and grandpa wanted to be held at the church. Pompous pastor was too busy, but as pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting, with my grandma literally on her deathbed. Grandma, grandpa and Aspastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then Aspastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then, Aspastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs, because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. Aspastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21, Luke 12:34, etc. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried, and never ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehab. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, weep with those who weep. But nobody, not Grandpa, not her daughter, my mom, nor any of my uncles or Grandma's siblings, ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, former Marine sergeant and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed Aspastor and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away, and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Pompous pastor and Aspastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from Big White Church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited Pompous Pastor and Aspastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing this, although you all know me and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife. Tell a story about her that is worth remembering, or anything else that you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today." I have asked several family members to prepare statements, but you don't have to have anything prepared. Please, if you want to say something, come up here and do so. There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours and, as best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging. 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favourite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favourite hymns. Afterwards, Dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few remarked that funerals are better without preachers anyway, or something similar. Remembering her pastors and her church in her will. The 1-2 punch. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills because, she told my mom, that makes it easier for us to respect each other's turf, and because their lawyer had recommended it. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighbourhood for the past 50-plus years, and had worked hard and lived modestly. But it was rumoured that they had a very nice nest egg. Of course, there is no legal requirement for anyone to attend the reading of the will, or to even have a reading. Modern telecommunications and near-universal literacy have made this quaint custom practically extinct. But the reading of the will was a tradition in our family because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit, extended family an excuse to get together. We never had family reunions. They were too difficult to schedule for our large family. But we got together at birthdays, holidays, funerals, baptisms, etc., so that if you attended several of these, you would see just about every one of your cousins, aunts, uncles, and even great-aunts and uncles who were Grandma's and Grandpa's siblings and in-laws. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumour mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa, that Grandma's will contained some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see pompous pastor and ass pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. Grandma had a large family, so a sizable number of beneficiaries were named in her will. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in, every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that pompous pastor and ass pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these two preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely, and practically impossible for them to leave the packed to more than overflowing room before the entire meeting was over, because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after all of the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant, amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was first beneficiary listed in the will. But after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s. Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece and nephew received a little more. Then several local non-profits received very nice amounts, etc. Bequests to Big White Church, pompous pastor and ass pastor were, almost, the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation, as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's largesse. When Grandma's lawyer got to the big white church and preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual, but before I announce these bequests to big white church, pompous pastor and ass pastor, Ms. Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present." He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. "For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me, come to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly, and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many, many years. But when I needed you and your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit, when I was dying and I invited pompous pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly, even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church, maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they loved to hear pompous pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But pompous pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. Ass pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will, that's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. Ass pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will, long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20%, of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, Big White Church. This amount was named the amount, an enormous shitload of money, generating muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as pompous pastor and ass pastor. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to Big White Church to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely, and no longer able to work my ass off for them. For free, like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to ass pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to pompous pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The pompous pastor and ass pastor sat there looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud. But we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. There is one last bequest, the lawyer continued, for a charity called, which he named and I'll call, Black Charity. Then he paused before naming the amount. Most of us had no idea what Black Charity was, but by the looks on their faces, we could tell that pompous pastor and ass pastor knew Black Charity very well. Their faces displayed the same expressions of shock, dread, and horror that they would have if the lawyer had said, "This bequest goes to the demonic baby eaters to buy extra large rotisserie barbecue grills and tons of charcoal." Every eye in the room was now fixated on pompous pastor and ass pastor. The lawyer, who happened to be my uncle, one of Grandma's and Grandpa's sons, let the silence continue a few seconds more. If we had been able to read pompous pastors' and ass pastors' minds, we would have known the history behind the looks on their faces. Black Charity was sponsored by a large black church just a few miles from Big White Church. They ran a free food clothing bank, assistance programs for foster children, home delivery of pre-cooked meals for homebound seniors, legal aid, and other social services. A long time ago, Big White Church, which was, and still is, 100% Caucasian, had provided a few years of financial and other support to black charity. Then there was a very bitter, acrimonious breakup, allegedly because black charity was practicing the social gospel, while Big White Church was preaching the true gospel. Big White Church even sued to try to get some of their money back, although the suit was eventually settled and very little money actually changed hands. But, this being the Deep South, everyone knew the real reason why Big White Church, or any white church, would stop supporting a black charity. Those niggers were getting uppity and not staying in their place. Grandma and Grandpa had seriously considered leaving Big White Church at that time, but they had reasoned that it was better to stay there and teach tolerance by their words and example. They knew they would never persuade everyone, but maybe they could reach some of the youth at their white church and break the generational cycle of racism. Grandma used to tell us, "My church is my mission field." We did not learn the true depth of her statement until after she died. Since then, Grandma and Grandpa had secretly sent a portion of their tithe to black charity every month. Most of Grandma's family, including me, didn't find out about any of this until after the meeting had ended. But pompous pastor and ass pastor obviously understood what Grandma, by her actions, which are more powerful than words, was saying to them. If you had grown up as a white person in the Deep South, as Grandma, Grandpa, pompous pastor, and ass pastor had, you would understand. To many white Southerners, this was one of the most personally insulting things you could do to them. It simultaneously labeled them as racists, condemned their bigotry, and crushed their delusions of white superiority by saying, "These black human beings, whom you hate, disrespect, and have mistreated, are better people than you are. So they deserve my money more than you do." Having allowed time for everyone to observe pompous pastor and ass pastor while they thought about how their white church had treated this black charity and how they and their church had treated our grandma, the lawyer said, "The amount is." Then he named the exact same amount that Grandma had named in her handwritten letter, the huge amount of money that would have gone to Big White Church if she had not changed her will. The revenge was really brutal and destroying. By donating to black charity, Grandma highlighted her true values, offering both a financial and moral slap to the church, and leaving 1 cent to the ass pastor was personal. It was really a big slap that the poster really deserved. The next story is from Earth Rogue. Veteran mechanic taking advantage of active duty military and retirees, messes with the wrong person, and his buddy goes down with him. When this started, all I was trying to do was get out of paying for something I didn't need and never asked for. By the end, I was going for blood as someone else enacted their revenge. I posted this over in r/military stories, and after a couple comments realized it belongs here too. I'm adding some edits to give context for those without military experience. This happened back in 2002 on Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego. I was stationed down the way at 32nd Street Naval Base for my Military Occupation Specialty School and was a new Lance Corporal, E3 at the time. I had a 1994 Dodge Spirit with 180k miles or so, and I'd just driven it across the country. I bought it a few days before leaving KS at an auto auction. A couple weeks into my school, it died. At the gate, next to the sentry. After an initial freak out that I was a suicide bomber, and the subsequent search of me and my car, everyone calms down and they help push my car to the top of the hill so I can coast down the other side and into the auto repair shop parking lot, which thankfully went without incident. Before I go in, I call my dad and then his cousin. My dad knows a ton about cars, and his cousin is a mechanic with his own very successful shop, like a dozen work bays, and they handle everything from regular cars to farm equipment to semis. I know a fair bit about cars on my own, but he knows everything. Between us, we decide it looks like the distributor or the distributor cap is the issue. My dad's cousin says it's a common issue on spirits from this time and recommends I get it fixed here by a real mechanic. Now, at this point, it's important to note his shop did a very thorough once-over for me after I bought the car and gave me good notes on the condition of the car in writing from his shop. I go in and talk to the guy at the counter. They're not too busy and pull it into a bay and run their diagnostics. Same thing. Distributor cap. Cool. I get the services agreement saying they'll replace it and call me if they find anything else. I hear nothing until the end of the week when they call and say my car's ready. When I get there, they present me with a bill for like $1,400. Wow. Just wow. Now my heart has stopped beating and I say something about that being a lot for a distributor cap. The guy who owns the place, I find out he's a veteran from way back, breaks off talking to a Master Sergeant, MSGT E8, and comes over to talk to me. He starts telling me about how it was much worse than they originally thought, and they ended up having to replace my radiator, plus hoses, and my timing belt and a head gasket. I'm still in shock and say something like the head gasket was fine 2 weeks ago, and so was the radiator and the timing. He puts his hand on my shoulder and tells me I don't know what I'm talking about, because they've been waiting to fail for a long time now. I'm confused now and say that's not possible. I bought it 2 weeks ago and he cuts me off and says I was sold a complete lemon and I should have had it checked. He says he felt bad for me and this should have cost over $2,000, but he cut me a deal and he can work with me in an installment plan, but will have to charge me interest. Now I'm suspicious and starting to get pissed, and I say the only repair I authorized was a distributor cap, and they should have called me before doing anything else. And I start to explain I've got paperwork from the inspection I'd done that said those other things were fine. I'm going to get it from the car, and the MSGT grabs me by the arm and starts telling me I'm being ungrateful and disrespectful to a respected mechanic and business owner, and asks me if I'm implying he's cheating me. Every time I try to open my mouth, he cuts me off and keeps telling the owner not to worry. He'll make sure this young pup pays what is owed. He's threatening to take me over to admin and have my pay docked. Now, I'm angry and a bit scared. Another Marine intervenes and says, that's a little extreme, and to let me say my piece. I get permission to get into my car, to get my maintenance history, which includes an oil change, the inspection documentation, and the original quote for the distributor cap work. At this point, there's a crowd of customers and some other passers-by. The owner of the garage and MSGT are in full theatre mode, talking about how I'm not appreciating the huge help they've been, and I'm trying to get out of paying for work I asked for. Now, I'm mostly just pissed. I come in, and the MSGT cuts me off and tells me to be careful how I talk to his friend. I ask the MSGT if he's going to let me speak or keep interrupting me while I'm in a private conversation with a business owner. I ask him if he owns part of the shop. No. And ask why he's so interested in not hearing a Marine out. Then I get out the original statement of services and say the distributor cap is all I agreed to. I also ask why he didn't call me, and he says he called my barracks several times and left messages including ones telling me the car was undrivable until the repairs were made, so he went with the lowest cost option to get me back on the road. Oops. I say, that's interesting. The only number I gave you is my cell phone, and I don't have any messages or even attempted calls until the previous evening when they left a message that my car was ready. I show everyone my call history, including a captain who's very interested and standing quietly by. The MSGT has backed off, and the captie is quietly talking to him off on the side. Now the owner is backpedaling a bit and saying he was thinking of a different customer, but he's already made the replacement and has to charge me for the work. Then I pull out the stuff from the inspection, and it has some fun little statements in it. Statements like, timing belt good, timing good. Check again in 30k miles. Radiator appears to be recently replaced. All hoses new in last 6 months. Nothing on the head gasket, but there's a statement that there are no leaks in that area, which was why he said he had to replace it. I say he can put all of my original stuff back on, because all I'm paying for is the distributor cap work. He gets red-faced and starts demanding I pay for the labour, and he can't put things back on because they were too badly damaged in the removal process. Now some old retired guy chimes in from the back and asks, "What kind of mechanic damages things when they take them apart?" The owner drags out my radiator, and there is a giant hole in one side that looks like it was stabbed with a crowbar. Now a couple other people, locals, are questioning past situations where he helped them out with repairs they didn't know they needed. The MSGT tried to walk off, and a colonel and a sergeant major in civilian attire post him to the side for a later conversation. The cap pulls me aside and asks to see the info I have, and to see my phone again, and steps behind the counter to photocopy it all. He has a truly evil grin. Turns out he's a prior enlisted former infantry marine who became an officer after going back to college. He has suspected this shop of being crooked for a while, but never had enough proof. He's on the commanding general's staff, and they were looking into complaints from permanent personnel and retirees in the area. The owner is sweating bullets now. I only pay for the distributor cap and get a statement that says my balance is 0, so he doesn't try anything in the future. The capt takes me to dinner and gets my info, and basically a statement from me of what happened. After dinner, he takes me back to his office while he types up something for me to sign about the whole incident, and I call Verizon to get them to fax over the incoming, outgoing calls from my number from the past week. He explains that the MSGT has been steering a lot of customers to his buddy, and they suspect he's getting kickbacks. The capt and several others have been taking their cars there for months to try to catch the guy doing what he did to me. The MSGT sealed his fate when he started threatening to take my pay. They suspected he was getting kickbacks or favors in exchange for hooking up his buddy. Now he has the justification he needs to formally look into the MSGT. The capt was thrilled and bought me a 6-pack for using up so much of my Friday evening. I wasn't around long enough to see the outcome, but when I left, there were auditors from base services going through the business with a fine-tooth comb, and it was a legal matter. Once something like that gets started, it probably means a business, and the owners will get kicked out of the on-base location. The base owns the building, and the owner leases it. He and his business would also end up blacklisted as a place known for taking advantage of service members. Most commands give this out to people who check in, so no one patronizes them. It still boggles my mind that one veteran would try to use that status to take advantage of others, or that a senior Marine would do that to other Marines. I know there are people out there like that, but having the shared common background we do, I expect better. Edit. Yeah, that last paragraph sounds naive. Just wishful thinking in my part. There are good and bad people everywhere in life, and the military is no different. Edit 2. This post really seems to have resonated, and that makes me happy. Thanks for all the comments and messages, and thanks for the awards. The revenge was really perfect and was impeccably executed. By exposing the fraudulent mechanic and his enabler, the Master Sergeant, OP not only saved himself, but likely protected countless others from similar scams. The revenge was really satisfying and cool. The next story is from Fweek in Little. Give my hours away to a new hire? I'll leave you with a store to close yourself, misfiled paperwork, and get you fired. I've been lurking on here for a while and finally wanted to post this. Formatting is going to be messy on mobile. This is a long one. Stick around for the juice. This happened a couple months ago at an old employer. I worked at a supermarket in my state throughout high school, and while in college in the United States, making $9 to start and only $10.50 at the end. The store had one store manager, 2 assistant store managers, 1 manager, and assistant manager per department, which there were 9 departments. For 5 years, I worked every position there because who knew what hiring was, right? Understaffing was a regular here. So if a department needed closing and I worked, I had to close it. From stocking to register to manager's duties, everything was game. My biggest acknowledgements were being a bookkeeper, out terms of the person who keeps track of all the money, monitor, glorified cashier, basically wrangle the regular cashiers and divvy up cash drawers to each register, service desk, cigarettes, lottery, customers, and store opener closer. There were 5 people who knew bookkeeping, 2 other people besides me, and the 2 managers who ran the front end of the store. There were about 5 monitors who all needed to be trained on service desk as well. Every monitor and bookkeeper needed to know how to open the store and close it. For being a supermarket in a town with about 20,000 people, we were severely understaffed. I worked 12 to 16-hour shifts at least once a week because people would call off all the time. Keep all this in mind for later on. Backstory. I started working here at 16 in high school, originally as a stock person. 25-hour work weeks, eventually moved up to 35-plus hour work weeks. Moved up to register, then monitor, then service desk, and finally bookkeeping when I turned 18, now 21. The hours were always good, never had a week drop below 35 hours at least. But it all changed because of some dickhead. At the start of COVID-19, I was working while in college, so all these guidelines had to be followed. Everyone needed their toilet paper and hand sanitizer to keep COVID away. No biggie. On top of the guidelines, we also had been hiring a copious amount of people. This store had a history of training new hires with other people who have been working for maybe a month or so. So, as you could guess, training was a disaster. But since COVID-19 had the store busy all the time, we needed more people. I wanted to train people the right way, because I got sick of doing other people's jobs. In March, we had gotten 4 new hires to train for my position. Now these new hires needed training on the service desk. Easy, let them run it while I watched and helped out the best I could. Easiest way to get people to learn. Most of them needed trained on here because there were 3 of us total at the time who could run it. After training everyone, 1 per shift at a time over 4 weeks, there were 7 people now ready to the world. But everyone who knew how to run the service desk needed training on monitor too. Guess who had to train everyone for another position? After another 4 weeks of everyone got trained. Around this time was the end of May. This is where the juice begins. The juice. Starting in June, we had been starting to lay off the hours since COVID-19 started to slow down. Hours started to get cut from all the register people, from about 20-30 hours a week to 10 hours max. We got overstaffed and people started quitting left and right. Not a big deal because those positions were easy to fill, but that's when my hours started getting cut. At the time, the 1 new hire who started in March, who we'll call Helen, had been getting really good hours. I'm talking about my hours. We had the same problem, college money, car money, the works and all. But then I got scheduled for 16 hours 1 week, and they got scheduled for over 35 hours. Not once since I was 18 did I get less than 35 hours. So I decided to confront the assistant manager who was in charge of scheduling. We'll call him Frank. Me. Hey Frank, I noticed my hours got cut. What's happening? Frank. I know. Everyone's hours are getting cut. I have to make room for everyone, you know. Me. I couldn't help but notice that Helen is getting quite the hours, so you made room for her and no one else? Frank. I was unaware of that. I'll get you some more hours next week. The reset of the week was kind of boring since I was a workaholic. No one called me to cover shifts or anything. The following week, I asked around to see who covered any shifts last week, and it turns out that all the new hires got called first. That kind of pissed me off, but hey, can't do anything about it now. Later that day, I checked my schedule, and what do you know? The same 16-hour week. I was livid at this point. I should have been honored for my seniority there, not getting hours. I went back to Frank and confronted him. Me? Hey, what the hell is this? I thought you'd be finding me hours this week. I can't live off of this. Frank. Well, it turns out that I couldn't find you hours. I tried calling. Me. Tried calling me. Not a single person called me. Instead, all the new hires got called. What the hell, man? Frank. There's nothing I can do. You might have to just find another job. This pissed me off beyond belief. I was ready to pop. But this is when my bright idea came into play. For a couple days, I searched around for other supermarkets in my area offering jobs. After about a day of searching, I found a job paying double what I made now for the same qualifications. I gave them a ring and got an interview for the following week. The following day, I went into work, for what I didn't know was my last shift, and told Frank what was happening. Me. Hey Frank, I just wanted to let you know I took your advice. Frank. Advice? Do you mean finding another job? Me. You're right, I hope you have fun. I will never forget the look on his face. Completely baffled. He didn't expect me to actually find another job so quickly. This is where my revenge began. Revenge? After I walked out of Dickhead Frank's office, I went around doing my usual work. During every shift, paperwork needed to be processed in the computer in order to close the store correctly and set up bookkeeping for the next day. Fun fact, that day in particular was Snap Day. For those who don't know what that is, it's the day that government-funded food stamps arrive on everyone's EBT card, monthly. That day I decided to paperwork and just don't do it. I was quitting that day because my anger got the better of me. The store closes at about 12 a.m. and I walked out of that hole as free as can be. The next day, I woke up to find some really obnoxious and angry texts from co-workers. I completely disregarded them, unknowingly that they said I worked that morning. I went down to the supermarket to grab some things for my house, and as soon as I walked in the door, every ex-co-worker of mine looked at me as if I had just passed on the floor. One of them pulled me aside, let's call them George, and this happened. George: What the bro? I had to cover your shift this morning and you have the balls to walk in here after that? Me: I don't work here anymore. I continued to get my groceries and talked to one of my closer ex-co-workers there about what happened. As it turned out, the Frank had no idea that the previous day was my last and that the entire front end of the store had gotten brutally. Since the store closed at 12 a.m. and no paperwork was filed, our corporate called the assistant manager, also in charge of making sure all departments are closed correctly, and asked where all the paperwork was. No idea that I had not filed it, Frank had to go into the store, over an hour away from him, to file all the paperwork himself. Not only that, tons of violations were given to him because, since none of the paperwork got done by the person closing, no one had a record of anything done at the store from the previous day. On top of everything, the amount of paperwork needed done was practically doubled since that day was Snap. As soon as the store manager heard about this, she was livid. After about a month, I was working my new job and heard some information about Frank. Apparently, he had to go into a meeting with our corporate bosses and the store manager. He had gotten fired from his position due to all of this and had not been able to get a letter of recommendation from that employer also. Sucks to suck, huh? TLDR, manager gives my hours away to new hire and tells me to get another job. I walked out and got him a bunch of violations and fired due to his stupid remarks. The revenge was perfect and executed strategically. Arrogant people like Frank deserve the same consequences for treating people working under them poorly. It is satisfying to see Frank losing his job. The revenge was really cool. The next story is from prestigious_issue 330. Terror neighbours make our lives hell. Returned the favour by getting them raided. As we found out that we'd be expecting, not one but 2 kids, we knew we had to move to a real house with more space. At the time, we were still living in a 1-bedroom studio 1 up from the ground floor, with its only entrance being a metal fire escape. Stairs. Not ideal for a pregnant woman, let alone to live with 2 small babies. So we found a privately leased house that was newly renovated and had all the room and a large garden we were looking for. Signed the lease and immediately collected the keys. As the owner drove off, the woman next door comes up to me, immediately demanding we not make noise before noon, as her BF works nights and sleeps in, and a whole bunch of other do's and don'ts. So right at the bat knew, trouble incoming. As the house was fully renovated and not much had to be done, we were like, don't poke the bear, we'll do the things that make noise after noon. We moved in after 2 weeks and the whole street was warm and welcoming. My wife was almost due, giving birth to my twin daughters, and some offer help with anything we needed. Real kind people. They also told us about our neighbours. Nobody liked them, He was a big bully and got into arguments with everybody. Also were known as radio pirates, as in illegal broadcasting on radio with all Dutch bangers. This music is just terror on your ears and possibly used on terrorists on black sites, which went alongside them partying Thursday, Sunday till 5 in the morning. Loud music, constant yelling, always drunken, etc. Really something to look forward to when moving in, certainly with 2 babies on the way. The partying began immediately, full blast. Real classy for someone demanding to be quiet when douchebag needs his beauty sleep. Then one day, my FIL came to put new grass in. He has his trailer parked at the back of our houses, which is public space. Not according to him though. Know that exact spot where the trailer, full with grass sods, quite heavy stuff, was parked was his spot, and we had to move the trailer. Not going to happen, as I was not planning to walk all the way around the house with the sods. He gets angry right away and demanded me to move it. I told him to go f himself. I was done with him already then and there. I'm also a ginger, so besides having no soul, I do have a temper, which is always in check until you provoke me repeatedly. Anyone who knows me will tell you that you really had to make an effort for that to happen. We went on working, and end of day comes when my FIL wants to leave. Hooks up the trailer, and bam, there was douchebag, telling him off, yelling, it's his spot, and he better does not do this again or else. Mess with me all you want, I can handle it. But what you don't do is threaten my family. I ran outside and told him in no uncertain terms to back off, or he'll be the sorry one. Total bluff on my side. Yes, I have that temper, but I'm not impressively built and have no hidden fighting skills. I do fight dirty. He backs off, FIL leaves, and I go inside where I find my wife crying. She got scared of him maybe doing something to her father, and or me, and this is something we don't need right now. Combined with hormones from being pregnant, and you can paint that picture. So I'm even more pissed, but had to promise not to act on anything. I won't, dear. Not yet anyway. Time went on without any real incident, and then came the time my wife goes into labor. Didn't go smooth and ended up having to deliver with C-section, or whatever it's called, because daughter 2 was almost strangled by the umbilical cord. We had to stay 3 nights, excruciating nights due to a lot of things. Finally, we get to go home. Family had put a giant sign in our front yard welcoming the babies. The sign was already up for a few days prior to coming home, so our friendly neighbours definitely knew about it. But did they give a f***? No, they did not. From the first night on, they started to party and broad blasted their terror music. They started at noon and continued to until 5 or 6 in the morning. Classy. They also kept going for days, so it wasn't just Thursday. Sunday, it was all week long, and the next. So we were broken, hardly slept. One of our daughters suffered from heavy cramps combined with all the noise, and her parents at the end of their wits, so she cried a lot. And then I just had it. I researched some things on radio pirates, the laws and regulations, and on his large 5 mem-to-plus antenna in his backyard, which was illegal in itself, but he used it to illegally broadcast on radio, which meant he had a lot of equipment to do so, which was even more illegal and can even get you jailed. But at the very least, they could seize it all and fine him big time. In the 1045k area. Now, I did not immediately turn him in, but instead were looking for another house to lease first. This because I figured it wouldn't sit well with him and having a wife and 2 babies in the house alone during the day because I had to go to work. I hear you guys thinking, why not involve the police? Well, they are utterly useless in cases like this. We called once, and what they did disturbs me to this day. They rang at their doorbell and immediately started off by saying, we called them about noise complaints. Yes, you read that right. No protection or whatsoever. Just blatantly told them we were the reason they're there. Told them to keep it down, and that was it. They didn't even follow up with us or anything. As you can guess, douchebag now was even more pissed and told me the next day, or yelled over the fence that separates our backyards, that I really should not do that again. A threat yet again, of which I told the police. I didn't report it the first time as I chalked that up to alpha male and heat of the moment. But without witnesses to corroborate, Nothing could be done yet again. Some days later, I walked out the front door and he just stepped out of his car. Came up to me demanding I cut back some of our ivy that grew on our side of the fence because it tangled in with his big-ass antenna. He would be gone for some hours, and I could come into his garden to cut back the ivy that grew through on their side. And then a light bulb went on above my head. I told him politely that I would do that immediately. Why? Because that gave me the opportunity to find out the make and model of this antenna to ascertain its signal strength, where the cables go exactly and what kind of cables they were, again to know the signal strength it handled. Also, it gave me a good view on the equipment he had through the window so I could snap some photographs of it. This was the icing on the cake, because in the meantime, we did manage to find a new home and already had signed the lease so we would be gone in 2 weeks. Luckily, we only had to paint some walls for the girls' room and furthermore, just pack up our things and move them to the other house. So after I trimmed the ivy and collected my evidence, I went online that night to find out the proper channels to report a broadcast pirate and which entity was tasked with catching said pirate. Turned out I had to call the telecom agency, but also the police. Wasn't too happy with the latter, but I remembered I have a nephew that works for the police. Officially, his area was immigration, but knew enough colleagues that could help us, and we could trust not to confront them again, saying I was the one that sent them. That was extremely important for our safety when doing what I was doing. So I gave both the agency and the police all evidence I collected, pointed them to the frequencies he pirated so they could listen in. Then they started a neighborhood investigation, which wasn't really necessary, but this was to cover our asses to make it look like he got caught by accident, because they had an active investigation in our area. You never know what he can learn from legal documents and such. We asked them to wait with the raid. Yes, they raid pirates' houses, preferably in the early hours of the day, because of his beauty sleep rendering him incapable of fleeing or hide evidence, etc. We moved 2 weeks later, and they raided him 2 days after we moved. All of his equipment, computers, radios, cell phones, and his car were seized. He left in cuffs, his wife GF did too, for making a big scene and tried to interfere. All of which was live reported to me by one of my ex-neighbours who were equally ecstatic about this. It turned out this wasn't the first time he got caught, but his third time, his car had no insurance on it and his MOT failed. This would normally have no big consequence because he didn't drive it while raided, but they had the guy surveilled on for a week, and that definitely meant he was seen driving it while not having insurance and valid MOT. He was fined somewhere around 30k euros, went to jail for 12 weeks, and everything seized was destroyed except the car. His GF had I do 40-some hours community service. They had to sell the house, which made for very happy neighbours as they too were over and done with them. Like I said, I do fight, but very dirty. You have to really make an effort for me to get to that point. They did and suffered. Over a year later, when shopping groceries, I encountered them. With the foulest of looks, if looks could kill, I'd be a smouldering heap of ash. But nothing more than that. Damn, folks. Kinda surprised about all the appreciation. Gold and silver awards, wholesome, masterpiece, helpful, bravo grande, and so many upvotes. Thank you all, kind people. I honestly do not know what I can do with gold or silver, but I promise you I'll spend it by giving back. Period in our lives turns into something better this way. This revenge was truly exemplary. OP's toxic neighbours got what they deserved. Their dismissive and arrogant behaviour finally backfired, sending them to jail, and they had to pay a hefty amount as fine. Very interesting Reddit story from Extra Chaotic Good. Teacher makes false claim of me faking an injury, so my mom messes with her career. I apologize for the format. I'm typing this on my cracked phone screen. I, 15F, have had a long and elaborate history with injuries, especially breaking my arm. Starting from literally the day I was born, my health has been complicated. I have a few conditions, but none serious enough to impact my daily life as I know it. I have a very weak immune system and somewhat easy to break bones. On top of that, I am the definition of clumsy, and I'm also a huge idiot who gets herself into dangerous situations for fun. My mom, 40F, has obviously known me from birth and knows just the extent of my weird bad luck and health issues. I've broken my arms a collective 13 times over my entire life, and almost every time I got injured or sick, it seems somebody had something to say about it. IDK why, but teachers just love to say that students that get hurt often are attention-seeking fakers, and a lot of relationships with authority figures have been harmful because of this. Every time it's the same. For some reason, a teacher doesn't believe me. They call me a liar in front of everyone. I get bullied for a while, and then I have to try and prove that I'm not faking. I could post so many stories about teachers doing this, but this is a story about the time my mom actually managed to get revenge. This all took place around 7th grade. I was 12 at the time, and I had broken my wrist by climbing on top of something I wasn't supposed to, and then falling off like a dumbass. My wrist was in a Velcro cast since I'm very allergic to the regular cast material, as they figured out through many cases of trial and error. My teacher, let's call her Mrs. Tablet, since this took place while we were learning about Egyptian tablets. She taught history, and our personalities clashed a bit. I'm more of a creative, adventurous, free thinker type, and she was very conservative, by the book, and proper. We hadn't had any real issues before this, but we just didn't mesh well. She was absent one day, and we had a sub in. I knew the sub as one of my teacher's friends and one of my bully's mum. I didn't like her, but I was still respectful in class and just tried to get my work done. She got me in trouble for doodling on my paper once or twice, but other than that, everything was fine. Or so I thought. The next day, I went into class like usual. We were working on an assignment about Egypt and their tables when Mrs. Tablet called me over to her desk. I went over, thinking she'd just get on to me for drawing on the back of my homework or something, only to get bombarded with a bunch of really weird questions. The interaction went something like, "Teacher, so Fire, do you know why I've called you up here? I know Fire isn't my Reddit name, but it's my IRL nickname, so I'm using it here." Me, "No ma'am, I can't say that I do." Teacher, "How long have you had that cast?" Me, "About a week now." Why? Teacher, "Do you really need that cast?" Me, yes? Teacher, "Well, the substitute told me she saw you take it off." Me, "It's a cast. I can't take it off. It would hurt." Teacher, "So if I asked the class, they'd say, you need that cast." Me, "Yes." Teacher, "And if I called your parents right now, they'd say the same thing." Me, "Yes, they were the ones who took me to the hospital. And she did this in front of the whole class." I was eventually dismissed, and people looked at me weird for the rest of class. As I later learned, apparently the substitute had told Mrs. Tablet that I'd taken off my cast as soon as I left class. I didn't. And that I threw it in my locker like, ha 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 ha, I'm getting away with doing less work. So basically, she pretended I was a bad guy in a crappy high school movie. IDK why she said this, but it had my teacher convinced that I was a liar and a fake. I technically could remove my cast since it was Velcro, but that would have been extremely painful, and it's not like I could just walk around without it. I wasn't going to make a big deal about it at the time, but it turns out she was serious about calling my parents. But she made the mistake of calling my mom. Now, me and my mother don't have a perfect relationship. She has anger issues, so we don't always get along well. But she loves me very much and doesn't let people like this mess with me if she can stop it. According to my mom, Mrs. Tablet called her all cocky and said things like, "Apparently your daughter is wearing a cast. Did you know that?" And, well, we all know how dramatic teenage girls can be, especially unique kids like her. She apparently even threatened to have me suspended before my mom stopped her and tore her to shreds for talking about her child like that. I don't think I'm allowed to repeat what was said, but by the end, Mrs. Tablet had to retreat with her tail tucked between her legs. She started being even more cold to me after that day and started giving me unfair detentions for not sitting still and doodling on the side of my worksheets. Even then, outside of school, we went to the same art studio sometimes. Weird that someone who hates art so much likes to paint. And poisoned the art director against me and got me put into a lower class. When me mom found out about this, she started the real revenge. My mom has never been a PTA mom. She honestly can't stand most of the PTA members, and their kids are chosen as favourites at my school, and use this power to bully others, including me and my friends. My mom is, however, friends with a very lovely woman on the county's school board, which has more power than the PTA. She told her friend everything that had happened and supplied all the doctor's notes needed to prove I needed my cast. Her friend managed to convince the rest of the board that Mrs. Tablet was discriminating against an impaired student, given her comments about me being slower at work and just wearing the cast to slack off, along with detentions related to me not sitting still when she knew I had nervous movements and slight ADHD. At the art studio, my mother pulled me from the classes. I took it upon myself to inform the fellow kids about why, and rumours spread quickly. Soon enough, kids were getting pulled left and right, and my art teacher was pulling at strings to try and get the situation under control. I actually think the studio went into temporary closure before reopening again. She was suspended for a week to go under investigation, and it turns out she treated a lot of the unique, as she put it, students in a similar way. She was verbally reprimanded by 2 different departments, and instead of getting her standard raise over the next 3 years, she'll only get half of that. Not only that, but she had to retake a course on how to properly treat students, and if she's ever caught to cross this line again, she'll lose tenure. She'll just be getting her bonus back at the start of next school year, and I'd just like to say that I hope she learned her lesson. Tile. DR. Teacher claims I'm faking my broken wrist. Calls my mom. My mom calls her friend at the county school board and gets her suspended for discrimination and gets unfair art program temporarily closed. Edit. I had misremembered the punishment given to that teacher. Upon asking my mom to retell the story, I fixed it to make it accurate. Thank you to the Redditor that pointed out the mistake. I suppose that my 12-year-old self remembered a raise as a bonus for some reason. The revenge was satisfyingly perfect, executed with precision. The teacher deserved to be humiliated and stripped of his reputation. It was truly a career-destroying revenge. Such toxic teachers deserve the same fate. The very interesting Reddit story from RivCA. When service personnel screw the pooch. Here's a story for you. I served from 2009 to 2016 in the US Navy, originally slated as a nuclear machinist's mate. Location names will be used except for private businesses and people who work at the same. But if you're familiar with the area, you should know what's going on. One weekend in November 2009, I was wrapping up my A school, the first school that we had to go through to get qualified as Navy nuclear operators. My classmates and I didn't feel like spending the whole weekend on base studying, so we went off base to the local mall and shopping centre. I was perusing the local tabletop game store, the Dragon's Roost, first name change, and I was intrigued by all the Warhammer 40,000 models on display. Most of it was artfully painted and placed on display for people to see what can be done with the hobby. I came across one diorama with a bunch of Space Marines duking it out with a squad of Tyranids. All the Marines had names associated with them, on flags flying for each, with people related to the store on the Space Marine side, US Navy, US Army, or good customer, insert name here. The Space Marines I could recognize as Brother Steve, the store owner, name changed, and Brother Shannon, his wife, name also changed. However, my eye was caught by one Space Marine, bolter pistol a foot away by scale, from his outstretched hand lying on the ground with a clean hole through his chest. His flag read, Brother Shoplifter. There had to be a story behind this. I asked Steve about it, and with it being a slow Saturday, lucky us, he launched into his tale. OP's note, I'll be shifting to his perspective as Steve told me the story. Back in the mid-90s, we were having a bumper day. I was ringing up customers non-stop. We had a bunch of off-duty sailors, airmen and Marines playing tabletop games on the side room, and my wife was generally wondering to make sure everyone was satisfied, given the day's chaos. I don't see Shannon stop in the breezeway between the rooms, putting her hands on her hips. One of the Marines did. Marine asked, "What's going on, Shannon?" She had started glaring at one kid, a fresh-out-of-boot airman, with a sweatshirt on, going up and down the comic book aisles, grabbing stuff and not putting everything back. She simply responded, "I think that man is stealing." All of the players got up from that table and went to cover the doors. 2 flanked Shannon, 1 to the back, 2 to the front, and 1 to either side of the aisle the booty was in. The 2 covering the aisle were both Marines built like a brick outhouse. They approach the kid and ask what he has under his sweater. The kid responds, "Nothing." "Nothing, huh?" An open palm punch flies out and hits the kid square in the chest, his arms flying out to either side of him to maintain balance, and comics drop out of the front of his sweatshirt all over the floor. "Nothing, huh?" Then loudly, "That looks like about $500 worth of stolen goods. Hey, Steve, isn't that grand larceny?" I started reeling a bit, but come to my senses and say, "Yeah, it is." Then the Marines both grab the kid and start hauling him out the front door towards one of the sailors' Camaros to shove him into the back and take him back to base. I figure they had it well in hand. Meanwhile, a shipyard bubba with his son in tow comes in and asks me what's going on. I told him it was a shoplifter and the serviceman had it under control. "Shouldn't you call the cops?" he asks. "Huh, yeah, I should." I step out front and call out to the group, "Hey guys, we have a witness." The Marines, who were having difficulty shoving the airman into the non-existent back seat of this Camaro, pause and look at each other and the sailor, then haul the kid back inside and plop him down between a couple of the display cases and stare the kid down, daring him to make a move while I call Charleston police. Within 10 minutes, a cop black as night and roughly 7 feet tall arrives to take charge. He's so tall, he has to duck under the doorframe to get in. He then asks me if I was the owner or the manager of the establishment. I responded, "I am the owner." The cop takes one look at the kid, now white as a sheet, and asks me, "What do you want me to do to him?" Not with "to." Charleston police will bend over backwards to please owners of any building or establishment they get called to, but don't give a hoot about managers or renters, this being the South. It's a very southern US thing. I just told the cop to take the kid back to whatever base he's from. They'll deal with him there. To my surprise, the cop is back within 20 minutes and told me that the kid was just going to get a slap on the wrist based on the reception he received. I wouldn't have that, so I called up one of my friends on the base, a Chief Master Sergeant, call him Chief, an E9 in the Air Force, and the first sergeant of the base at the time. I gave him the whole spiel, and he told me he will take care of it. We kept tabs through the kid's ordeal, where I found out he was put on extra latrine duties on his side of the runway and then immediately moved over to the other side of the runway to do more of the same for the landing planes and their lavatories. This had gone on for a good 3 months when his captain, Air Force 03, took notice and put in immediate transfer papers, seeing as the kid obviously pissed off one of his seniors and was getting hammered for it. As it turned out, all transfer papers crossed the first sergeant's desk for signing off and adjustments, up to and including recommended rerouting. He recommended Nome, Alaska, as the kid's next duty post. OP's note, the Nome base hadn't been in use since the mid-1950s by the Air Force, so I'm pretty sure Steve had that one mixed up with one of the other Alaskan bases, but the point was still valid. He called me to tell me what was up with Brother Shoplifter, and I figured that him getting transferred out would be the end of it. "Chief, no way, I'm not done with him yet." After another week, the chief called me and told me what was done. The conversation went roughly like this. "Nome's receptionist, Nome Air Force Base. This is Airman, redacted speaking. You're on an unsecured line. How may I help you, sir or ma'am?" Chief: "Hi, this is Chief Master Sergeant, redacted, First Sergeant at Charleston Air Force Base. I would like to speak with my equivalent there on your base regarding a personnel transfer." Airman: "Wait one?" Chief: "Sure." 5 minutes later. "Hello, this is Technical Sergeant, redacted speaking. We don't have a first here, but I am the ranking enlisted. What's up, Chief?" Chief: "I have a fresh transfer here going up to Alaska for a change in scenery. You should be seeing his papers come through pretty soon, but I need to talk to you regarding the reasons as to why he's being sent out of rotation." Tech: I have a new airman coming up from your neck of the woods. Name of airman brother shoplifter, but nothing stating as to why. Chief: That's him. This isn't someone trying to escape their depender, is it? Chief: No, this is someone who got caught up in a legal issue. The other party declined to pressing charges, so he has no local police record. But I wanted to let you know that he got caught shoplifting at one of our local businesses. A comic store by the name of the Dragon's Roost? Tech: Wait a minute, he stole from Steve? Once Steve finished telling us this gem, I and my buddies just started howling with laughter. We immediately took the lesson here to heart, in that the military is a very tight-knit community. The Navy nuclear community even more so, as our instructors had told us. I also bought a set of dice that I still use to this day. The revenge was really exemplary and exception. A small clue led to thief receiving consequences for his actions. It was a perfect revenge, showing the power of the military network. The revenge was really cool. Very interesting Reddit story from Time's Ugly Stepchild. You are just cattle to me. This story goes back pretty much 20 years now. To set the scene, I was working for a then cable TV company. The call center I was working at had been filled with guys poached from dial-up support companies countrywide to support this new super-fast broadband that was being trailed in country for the first time. 500K connections. Woohoo! I say this because that meant our call center at the time was full of some of the best support engineers anywhere in country. Some of the most intelligent people I have ever known. Anyway, after about a year there, 4 of us we asked to look into complaints sent to the managing director, hereafter known as Big Boss, about the service. Mostly, these were the original brand Karens of the day, but occasionally the customer complaining was someone rather important, and they needed the special touch, so to speak. Turns out the 4 of us has quite different skills, but complemented each other perfectly, and before long, we were firm friends with the Big Boss's personal assistant at head office, and had very good reputations to boot, after some devilishly difficult issues. Oh yeah, this is before Google, so being good meant you knew your not just how to look it up. It was a great place to work. Turnover was practically zero. The fact all our staff were experienced before getting to us meant we knew what we were getting into. Then came the new director, hereafter referred to as A-Hole. A-Hole had come from another call center in the company, a customer services call center. He was also completely inept technically. Seriously, this guy once told me that directors don't use Excel and only Word, so I needed to copy all the spreadsheets into Word so he could modify the content and pass off his bullcrap figures, showing all was well. He didn't understand how Excel worked as it transpired. Anyway, all was not well. In the short time he'd been there, he had alienated most of the best staff. He tried to turn the staff into script monkeys as he wanted every case fixed in X minutes. We were rebuilding TCP/IP stacks, hacking registries. Hell, we even talked a few people through Win98 rebuilds. You ever tried to talk your gran through changing a ringtone over phone? Now try imagining getting gran to rebuild Windows after Macintosh and Spymantech competed to see which could screw up her machine faster. Now try doing it in 10 minutes, or get hauled into A-Hole's office to be screamed at for up his figures. Morale was utterly obliterated, and we started losing good people. Head office knew something was wrong, so they sent word down the line that the Big Boss was coming for a meet and greet. That message went through A-Hole, so, of course, on that day, some of the more vocal employees were scheduled off. Those selected to meet the Big Boss were, I think the nice word is, sycophants, or people who were instructed what to say and followed out of fear. Upshot, Big Boss went away, thinking all was well, and there must be some other reason for the issues on site. My breakpoint came when my team was given an impossible task. By this point, I'd already handed in my 30 days. Was about to become a dad, so needed to get a proper career going. He wanted a flow diagram of every possible fault we were dealing with and its solution. And he wanted it all on a single piece of A3 paper. We objected, he demanded, we failed. We got reamed. Our manager got reamed, and let me tell you, she defended the hell out of us. We tried in vain to explain the nature of the calls, to explain that the reason we paid these very clever people to do this job was because they were essentially playing tech support to a nation of people who had turned a computer on for the first time ever today, did something they didn't know was stupid and broke their machine. That means their internet didn't work, hence our problem. His response, at a volume comparable with a tornado jet taking off at full burner: I don't let me get this through your heads. You are nothing, and I am a director, and when I tell you to do something, you do it, or I will fire every single one of you. I can replace any one of you anytime I want, because you are nothing but cattle. Now get the my office. I went home livid. My girlfriend at the time, pregnant with our first, worked in the same office, so while I was getting out, she would have to continue deal with a-hole. Knowing how he intended to treat my friends and family, I needed to do something. I didn't have a clue what I could do. Friday, I go into work, ostensibly to say my goodbyes and do exit interview, paperwork and such. One of those goodbyes was a phone call to Big Boss's PA. Me saying goodbye was a shock, because I'd been expressly forbidden to tell them over the previous month by, you guessed it, a-hole. She wanted to know why I was leaving. I told her. She asked me if I minded her telling Big Boss what I'd said. I'll be honest, I didn't seriously believe anything would come of it, but what the hell, I thought. Sure. I'll get back to you soon. And she's gone. 20 minutes later, she calls me and says, Big Boss wants to talk to me, so can he have my personal mobile number? I give it, and sure enough, minutes later, the big man himself calls. The next 30 minutes is spent detailing why I was leaving, why we had lost nearly 100 people already, and had 18 resignations that week alone. Why didn't I hear about this when I was there the other week? So I related the little personnel shuffle and the threats. This was my moment, and I tell you, I carped the hell out of that diem. Me, look, Big Boss, I get all you have is my word, and I could be just some disgruntled dipshit, but my friends and family are going to have to work here after I've gone. And by family, I mean my pregnant girlfriend, so I have to do something. If you want to find out the truth, here is what you do. Turn up on site unannounced for a day. Send out your own email to the site as soon as you arrive, giving no time for a-hole and his cronies to get to anyone. Tell them to come to you if they have any concerns. Here is a list of people that should corroborate much of what I've said. The rest, it's up to them if they want to do something. Then decide if I'm a After a bit more chatting, the call ended, and I went back to say goodbye to everyone. I told a few people, including my manager, what I'd done, and told them if Big Boss did turn up, to get in there and tell him what's going on. Then I bid them all farewell, and said I would see them all at the mass leaving do at the end of the month. I'm at my new job the Tuesday after, and I get a text from the GF. Holy Big Boss is here unannounced. More texts from other ex-colleagues saying pretty much the same thing. From what I gathered afterwards, Big Boss did exactly what I suggested, and it played out pretty much as I thought it might. There was a queue, a long one. That night, a-hole was summoned to Big Boss's impromptu office, and after that meeting, he went home. He was never seen again. I did get a call from Big Boss. He can't discuss details, but I'll be very pleased to know leaving do was pretty cool too, I think. On entry, I was told I wouldn't be paying for a single drink that night. From there, my memory goes from fuzzy to total blank. The hangover the next 2 days was brutal, but totally worth it. Update. A few people have asked if we knew any more on a-hole after the fact, so I went looking. I went looking again on things like LinkedIn and such, and after a lot of looking, fairly common name, I bashed in the right combo of name and company and found him. LinkedIn confirmed he lost his job in 2001 when this all happened. He eventually found a new job in 2002, but it seems he bounced through a few companies with pretty big gaps in his work history. Currently seeking new opportunities for the last 4 years. The revenge was perfect, and it was executed strategically. The arrogant director was humiliated and taken down, ruining his reputation and career at the same time. OP did a wonderful job by teaching a bitter lesson to the arrogant director. The very interesting Reddit story from #BurnItDown_. After a lifetime of abuse, I burned everything down and got what I wanted. I don't want to make this too disturbing, but read at your own risk. And it's really, really long. TLDR at the end. Throwaway, because people know my other account. Part 1. The childhood. My parents have always had a toxic and mutually abusive relationship. Physical fighting, screaming matches, destruction of each other's property, and then a short honeymoon phase. I witnessed it all. It was a cycle. Not only did they abuse each other, but my mother would physically abuse us with regular beatings, and my father would neglect us, allowing her to hurt us. We, my siblings and I, would see the worst of it on weekends. They would have events that lasted days, and often argued well into the late hours. My mother would even take us from home out of spite for my father and have us stay with her abusive family members for days and sometimes weeks. This, of course, would interrupt school and put us behind other students. I would often come to school tired after being kept awake by an incident between them. In addition to that, I was prevented from building meaningful friendships outside of school because of how strict my parents were. I wasn't even allowed to take part in extracurricular activities because they insisted they were meaningless and would corrupt me. Part 2. A child's revenge. I became resentful and angry. I hated that they would torment me and my siblings, and then could cuddle and be lovey-dovey with each other during the honeymoon periods of the cycle. It disgusted me. By the time I reached my early teenage years, I made a decision to sabotage them at any chance I got. It was easy, since I had been watching their patterns for years. I stole money from my father in small amounts. I destroyed emotionally valuable items from each of them. I threw out food they were saving as treats for themselves. I found receipts of purchases they were hiding from each other and left them out for the other to find. I destroyed clothing. I made each of them think I was siding with them after arguments, getting them to talk to me, and then took their dirty secrets back and forth to increase their distrust of each other. The funny part was, they never suspected it was me. I was just repeating the same behaviors they had already been doing, so they always assumed it was the other one. Part 3. The next level revenge. As the years passed, I knew I would be leaving the household when I was an adult, so I expanded on my plan. I knew that my younger siblings would suffer in a household with both of them together, especially after I left. I had been sexually abused in childhood by one of my mother's family members. My father and siblings didn't know, but my mother did. She knew what this person was and left me alone with him multiple times. She hinted to me that if my father ever found out about anything her family had done, I would be responsible for breaking up the family. That was how she got me to keep quiet about all of the abusive things her family members had done to us. Between the two of them, she was the worst. My father was really just neglectful and willfully ignorant of the deep levels of abuse she put us through. He thought that his role as a father was to go to work, bring home the money, and relax. I knew it would take something powerful to make him step up. I also knew that if they were exposed to the authorities, there was a chance my siblings would get separated or be forced to live with worse family members whose evil deeds couldn't be proven. I waited all the way until a few months before I was prepared to leave the household. Then I told my father what had happened to me. I told him all the secrets my mother had kept from him regarding how her family would abuse us whenever she took us to visit and stay with them. My siblings were never sexually abused, but they were beaten and starved. I told him I was only telling him this now because I was planning on moving out, and I needed him to wake up and protect my siblings after I left. I told him there wasn't any hope of saving anything with me, but there was still time for the others to still have a good life. He cried. It had the desired result. The news traveled through the grapevine in the family quickly. All of their secrets were out. It caused a divide and shook the foundation of everything. People who had married into my mother's family took their kids away quietly. The family's reputation was destroyed in the religious community as well. I got tearful calls from some of them begging me to forgive and forget. Some accused me of lying, or accused me of enjoying it, and even asked me to take it back. I had successfully set my family on fire. I left on schedule. I cut off contact with my mother. I had extreme limited contact with my father. I talked to my siblings constantly. My father stepped up. He cut my mother's family off and didn't allow them to see my siblings anymore. He divorced my mother a while later, once he had the means to take the youngest siblings away and live alone with them. My mother has extremely limited custody. The older ones had already moved out by that time. Part 4. The result. I now am living without any family in another state. I'm getting mental health treatment and living my life the best way that I can. I still talk to my siblings. They kept me updated on what's going on. My father is really taking care of the youngest ones, and he helps out the older ones when they need it. They have a far better life than I had, because he cares now. We don't talk that much about what happened and what I did for them. We still have a bond, and that's all I want. TL. DR. Parents and mother's family made my childhood an abusive living hell, so I destroyed my parents' marriage and exposed all of the abusers in the family. Plotted and manipulated the situation so my siblings stayed together and were taken care of. The revenge was perfect and executed flawlessly. OP's mom ruined his career, and OP ruined her mom's marriage by exposing her dark secret. It was the perfect medicine OP's mom needed. The most important point is that OP's actions finally created a safer and healthier environment for his siblings. The revenge was cool, and the story is fantastic. The story is from an unknown account. Ex-best friend slept with my ex-GF and blackmailed me, so I got him mocked by his friends and fired from his job. Sorry about the title, not really all that great with them. So I'm a gay man, though it took me a long time to actually come to terms with it. During the time when I was questioning, I was dating who I thought was a lovely girl. I'll call her Jane. I genuinely loved her and pictured us having a future together as we'd been dating for 3 years and had started to get pretty serious, even though we were only 18 when he split us up. You lot know what young love is like. Anyway, the only other important people in this story are my ex-best friend James and my absolutely incredible boyfriend Alex. Not their real names, by the way. Also, this is a long read, so sorry about that. I tend to ramble and I'm not that much of a writer. So sorry if this kind of sucks. James and I had been friends since we were about 10 or 11 and we got close, to the point that we felt more like bothers than best friends. He was really supportive of my relationship with Jane and would constantly talk about how glad he was that she made me happy. Though when I look back on it now, he had a habit of constantly talking about how gorgeous she was, sexy she was, and how I was such a lucky guy. I understand the last one, but he was a bit excessive when he talked about how attractive Jane was, but I was young and naive at the time and didn't think anything of it. That was until I caught them. I'm not much of a writer, but essentially I noticed that they were both becoming pretty possessive over their phones. They'd randomly disappear claiming to be feeling ill or having to get some project done, and I know it sounds stupid, but I kept noticing that the condoms I was buying were going missing. I always liked to make sure we had enough for precautions. I wound up going to Jane's house one day when she'd bailed on me claiming to have a migraine. I was partly worried for her health and brought some painkillers, food, and some bottled water, in case she genuinely did feel ill, but I also had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that she was lying to me. I don't know how to explain it, I just knew. Sure enough, when I let myself in with the spare key she'd given me, I found her in bed with James. I was heartbroken. The two people who I cared about most in the world and who I thought cared about me went behind my back like this. I was furious. We had a major argument. Jane begged me to listen to her, whilst James yelled at me, and I eventually just stormed out. I wanted to go and tell everyone what they'd done and shame them for it. But that's where the problem arose. Remember at the start where I mentioned that I was questioning? James knew about it. Of course he knew I'd never leave Jane to sleep with a bunch of guys, but he was fully aware that I'd figured out that I was attracted to guys and girls. More like just Jane in particular, as I don't really feel any attraction towards girls anymore. And he used this against me. He knew full well how terrified I was that my parents would disown me, and he made sure to remind me that if I didn't keep my mouth shut, then my parents would find out. At the time, this was absolutely terrifying, though I now know that they accept me 100% and still love me. So I kept my mouth shut. I was stuck having to work with James at his father's garage, as I couldn't come up with a way to explain how I was mad at him without letting everyone know what he did and risking getting outed to my parents. Besides, I needed the money, and there weren't a whole lot of other jobs I could apply for. Also, I really should mention that James was going out of his way to harass me at work, calling me a bunch of slurs whenever he got the chance, pushing me around and just generally reminding me that he could tell my parents at any point. I got really low at this point, and the only time I actually felt sort of content to just let myself relax and be myself was when I'd go to the local gay bars. There was one club in particular that I loved to go to, a drag club, where I met my boyfriend Alex. He was a drag queen there and helped out behind the bar and stuff when he was needed. To save any confusion, I'm just going to use he, him pronouns for him, though they do switch when he's in drag. We flirted for a few weeks before gradually becoming friends with benefits. He is amazing, and I know it sounds cheesy, but I was the happiest I'd ever been when he agreed to be my boyfriend. But that's skipping a little bit ahead. This revenge happened before we started dating, and we were still just friends who'd hook up every now and then. After a few months, I finally worked up the courage to open up to Alex about what happened with Jane and James, and that's when an evil look fell over his face. See, Alex is the sweetest guy you could ever meet, but if you piss him off, he can and will turn into an evil genius. Around this time, James had been bragging to me that the ladies loved him, and he could get any girl he wanted. I really doubt that. He'd always been kind of like this, but he upped the bragging in an attempt to annoy me. He also told me how any girl that I dated would leave me in an instant to sleep with him. So Alex suggested we put that to the test. Cue the revenge. We started off small. See, James had given me his email address a few years prior, and just as I'd thought, he couldn't be bothered to change it. So I decided to be very generous and sign him up to a premium subscription to several gay peon websites, and decided to be courteous and agree to receive emails about notifications, new offers, and other things he may be interested in, just to be nice and make sure he had some variety. Oh, did I mention that this was the email address he allowed his father to use? Oops, it cost me a fair bit of money, but I made sure that he got the best offers. Alex was more than happy to chip in to help me. It was worth it. When we were working in the garage and his dad stormed in and asked to speak to him. Now his dad didn't really give a about his kid being gay, but he was mortified that his son would order this much put in their shared email address. He genuinely thought for months that James was an addict. We may have signed him up for a bit more than we thought. I logged into the email after the first 2 weeks of him being signed up for the subscriptions, and he had well over 100 emails about his accounts. This is when, like we'd hoped, James started getting more aggressive. He'd barge into me, screw up my work to get me in trouble, and send me disgusting messages, as well as threatening, insulting me in person. I took note of everything. I kept a notepad to log the dates and times of the incidents, and kept a detailed description of everything he did, every insult and every threat. I'd screenshot all the messages from him and record every insult and threat that he'd hurl at me on my phone. Alex helped me organize all of this onto files, and then we saved it all onto a hard drive. This would be important for later. This is when we decided to move on to the next phase of our plan. The girlfriend. And no, not Jane. Also, I should mention that he and Jane split up only a couple of weeks after I found out about the affair. They were never going to last. See, Alex passes extremely well when he's in drag. Being feminine already makes it a bit easier. His voice isn't all that deep, and he can sometimes be mistaken for a girl with a slightly deeper voice. He usually exaggerates his makeup and clothing, but for this phase of the plan, we decided to get him to tone down the makeup slightly to make it appear more natural, and a mutual friend of ours took him aside and gave Alex some of her clothes to wear. We then created a fake Facebook account for my new girlfriend, And Alex and I posted some cute couple photos on this account and my own personal Facebook account, posting all your usual lovey-dove stuff that you see on couples' social media. Then we put our plan into action. Alex would come to pick me up from work a couple days a week, dressed as an extremely beautiful girl, if I do say so myself. We'd chat, hold hands, hug and kiss, and just generally act like a couple. James obviously noticed. He took the bait and began chatting to Alex when he was waiting for me to finish up, and eventually wound up sending him, or our fake account, a friend request, which Alex was all too happy to accept. It took a few weeks, but after a while of just talking about work, school, TV shows and music, James finally started to edge his and Alex's conversations into more territory, which was exactly what we were looking for. Alex answered accordingly. He had tried to send Alex nudes hoping to get some in return, but we deleted those straight away. We thought that would be a little too far, even for this douchebag. This continued for a few weeks until we had everything in place. Alex made sure to screenshot the messages, and then we went ahead and changed the name of the Facebook account to Alex's name and deleted the couple pictures on it. I sent the screenshots of the conversations with Alex to James's friends. They were petty accepting and usually were the ones to call James out when he was being an asshole, and they took great pleasure in mocking James for it. The look on James's face when his friends mentioned his little boy toy was absolutely priceless. I'm not sure he'll ever live it down. The people he picked on at school even snapped back at him that he's the one who was another guy, so where the hell did he get off calling them a faggot? This pissed him off to no end, as he knew that they were right, even if he hadn't known Alex was a boy at the time. James also had the sort of expected reaction and started sending Alex a bunch of hateful messages and threats, only helping our case as we'd screenshot the messages and add it to the folders on the hard drive. Once I had what we thought was enough evidence, I decided to take it all to James's dad, mine and James's boss, and explained everything that was going on. From the cheating with Jane to the blackmail and threats, he just sat there and listened, allowing me to show him the proof I'd gathered. He did find the petty revenge with Alex in drag petty funny, but the rest of the time, his face was just kind of blank, with a hint of anger in his eyes. He thanked me for the information and went off to speak with his son. James got fired on the spot. I agreed not to go to the police as this could end up with some pretty bad press for his dad's company, and his dad was a pretty cool guy. I knew he was all talk, so there was no real threat of danger. I received an amazing reference from James's dad for a job I desperately wanted and eventually got, no doubt helped by said reference. James's parent flipped out with him. They refused to give him his job back and made him go out and actually put in the effort to get and keep a job. He had gotten used to being able to slack off as his dad owned the place and technically couldn't fire him. They also sold the car they'd been letting him use and told him to pay for a new one with his own money. It took him about 2 years to save up enough money to buy his new car. It all eventually came out about James and Jane's affair. As for the threats of outing me, Alex kindly reminded James that he had absolutely no proof of me doing anything, whilst his friends all knew about the messages James had sent him, another guy. It would look like he was just pointing fingers because of a little petty revenge. James's father had also assured me that my secret was safe with him, so the threats of blackmail were now non-existent. James got into college on a scholarship and started hanging out with a bunch of other douchebags. I found out through a mutual friend that James was still a homophobic prick at college and was terrorizing a couple of LGBT students, as well as making disgusting threats against a lesbian girl in his class. None of them wanted to do anything about this, however. Why? Because James had been lying to them and saying that his dad was one of the higher-ups in the college or something. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention, and I can't remember exactly who he said his father was. But it was enough to make these poor kids worry that they could be kicked out of college for speaking up about this. I decided to lend a helping hand. With the help of our mutual friend, I emailed a bunch of the disgusting screenshots, recordings of some of the threats, and some of the homophobic, racist things he'd posted on his Facebook page, which he had deleted before the college could see them, to the higher-ups in the college. They were not happy with what they saw. They eventually revoked his scholarship after a few of the students, with some encouragement, spoke up about the harassment and threats. I honestly have no clue why he turned out like this. His parents are absolutely lovely, open-minded people. It's crazy. James's parents kicked him out after that. He stayed with his friends for a few months before he managed to get an apartment. Last I heard, he was working in a fast food restaurant, working to get into another college. I genuinely hope he bettered himself and that he can do well in his life. Everyone's capable of change, right? I'd also like to clarify that I didn't care all that much about getting back at Jane because, yes, she did have the affair, but I was getting some revenge on James for the blackmail and threats that came after it. Jane had showed me proof that she'd tried to prevent James from blackmailing me and told him to just let it go. If they'd both just stopped speaking to me after the affair, then this whole thing wouldn't have happened. I'd have been hurt and maybe a little awkward at work, but I wouldn't have gone out of my way to get back at him. Though I did fill Jane's mother in on what actually happened and sent her some screenshots where Jane admitted to the affair. This was after I found out that she had told her mother that I was the one who cheated with a bunch of guys and girls, instead of the "we just grew apart" version that we'd agreed to tell our parents. From what I heard, her mother was not all that pleased with her. I also sent a few of the texts where she admitted to having an affair to her new boyfriend. Needless to say, he wasn't happy to find out that he, abusive ex, was actually just an ex who she'd cheated on. They're still together from what I heard, so all I can say to that guy is, good luck, my dude. I eventually did end up coming out to my parents, and they were surprisingly supportive, which was amazing. And Alex and I got together a year or two after these events, and we're still very much in love. Sorry if this doesn't count as a pro-revenge, but a couple of friends suggested I post it here. I know there's probably a bunch of spelling mistakes and the story might be a bit all over the place, but I'm not much of a writer, so my apologies. The revenge was perfect, and it was executed brilliantly. Each step humiliated James multiple levels, publicly, personally, and professionally. Bro was destroyed every second. James got a bitter lesson of mean actions. It was really satisfying to see James finally working fast food.